Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and today we're meeting with Emily Foreman, author of the new book, We Died Before We Came Here, a true story of sacrifice and hope. Emily, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
To our audience who's watching, you are seeing on the screen a shadowed individual. This is done not for Emily's protection, but this is done for those who she ministers to in the countries in North Africa who are continuing to fight the battle of persecution because of their faith, because of the ongoing work that's being done. Most of you do not realize the cost that many of us pay in order to bring our message to countries where we are not welcome, where the individuals who come to faith are putting their lives on the line. Emily's work, her family's work, organizations like Open Door, who cover Christian persecution for many who are in Africa and Asia who have been willing to count the cost for their faith in Jesus. We are a nation here in the United States that we have not experienced 90,000 on average a year of believers losing their life at the hands of Islam because of their profession of faith in Jesus. In the nations who are predominantly Muslim, who make the decision to follow the Messiah, they have been willing to count the cost. And because of Emily's ongoing work in these nations, because of the work she continues to do, because of the people she has empowered and planted and taught in these countries, she has chosen to hide her own personal identity. And the message is, it is not about Emily. It is not about her work. It is about the work of the Lord and for the protection of those she so faithfully serves. Emily is a longtime ministry worker whose passion is to see the captives set free. She's had this desire as a child and still does today, and even after the death of her husband at the hands of an Al-Qaeda extremist. She's compelled by God's love for Muslims and inspired by her late husband's willing sacrifice. She and her family continue to work in North Africa and to strive to mobilize Christians across North America to see the Muslim world through a lens of faith. Her book, We Died Before He Came, this true story of sacrifice and hope, is a personal testimony to, in the face of death, and on the other side of death of a loved one, Emily has been willing to count the cost. The challenge today will be for you, our viewers, across the world, over 1 million of you, many of you in the Middle East right now, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, who are watching this program right now in the privacy of your homes. Will you understand how devoted Emily and her work are to bringing you eternal life? Emily, I am just so honored and proud to have you with us today.
The honor is all mine.
Emily, you tell a passionate story. You had to be willing to pay the price, but yet you say that this desire was implanted in you as a child. What happened that made you realize that there was a world out there that needed you and that God was calling to you and your husband, your future husband, to this kind of work?
Yeah, I would say, I grew up in a God-fearing family in a nice, wonderful, small church where I heard the gospel presented nearly every Sunday. I think it was probably by the time I was 13 that fully understood what it meant to make that faith that I was hearing all the time, make it my own. And what does it mean for me? And I think God opened my eyes to the fact that He didn't just want me in His family and His kingdom. He wanted to use me for His kingdom. And that happened when I was about 13, and a medical doctor came and showed pictures in our church and just really shared the need. And at that point, my world consisted of really my hometown, maybe the full of the United States, but my world was quite small until that day. And I not only heard the need, saw the need, and understood that there were so many who had never heard the good news. And I just became so convicted that, I have all of this to myself. How can I keep this faith to myself when there's a world out there that is in need? And a God, a Savior that I was following, that I was serving, that deserves the honor and the praise in the lives of every tribe, tongue, and nation. So that was probably the point where I really felt like God was pricking my heart and telling me, I just don't have a normal American 9-to-5 life for you. So when I met Stephen and Stephen and I were married, I realized that was kind of a confirmation. Stephen was a very deep believer in the Lord, very committed, made all his decisions based on what does God want in this situation, and what is God doing here, and how is it going to advance His kingdom in the world. And so when we were married, it was not, a surprise that the Lord finally told us, I want you to go. At that point, we didn't know where we were going. We had 3 small children. We just decided to take our kids, sell our house, sell our belongings, and take a trip to Texas to do some training of what it looks like to work in restricted areas, and how can we be effective in sharing God's love in these areas, still not knowing where we were going until the outreach phase, the practical phase of our training. We were going to this country in North Africa, had never heard of it before, really had not had a clear understanding of what Islam was. This is pre 9/11, of course, and we were quite sheltered here in our southern hometown, about the rest of the world, especially other religions. And so when the Lord took us there for 5 weeks to reach out to that area in the prisons, encountering lostness that I'd never, ever encountered before, it was definitely a different ballgame. I thought I was ready. I thought I'd sold out. I'm going to do anything for the Lord. We were like just gung-ho about it until we got there and realized, man, this is what darkness looks like. This is what need looks like, not just on a spiritual level, but on a physical level. Very impoverished country. And I have to be honest and say, when we left to come back to the U.S. to finish our training, the last thing on my mind was going back to that country. I just started believing that the Lord had somewhere else for us, maybe a little easier, somewhere, because I have three small children. Actually, I had a 4th on the way at that point. But, God has a way of just having His way in us when we're willing and obedient. And He eventually just gave us both, Stephen and I both, a real deep conviction, a real heart to go back to that country. And that's what we did. And this was just after 9/11. So we went back in with a whole different perspective, not really knowing what's going to happen. I mean, we had this perception that, the Muslim world hates the Christian world. We're obviously Christians, our skin color is totally different. We're going to stand out. And we knew enough to know that in the Islamic world, they categorize Christians as a whole and sort of group us into this group of infidels. Not all have this terrible perspective, but many do. Hollywood portrays what Christianity is in their mind because, the U.S. is a Christian country.
Right.
We had a lot of preconceived ideas coming at us from them, but I have to say it was vice versa. But when we arrived, it was completely different. When we made our home there, they were true to their nature of hospitality and just totally embraced us and broke down any barriers of fear and awkwardness on our part. And we just chose to let the Lord love them back through us. And we, quickly got settled. Wasn't easy, obviously, in many aspects, but definitely made it easier to make friends so quickly.
Once you came back to the States, you had this full flavor of what life was like in North Africa, which has an incredibly rich heritage. Most people don't realize that North Africa was a large Jewish Sephardic community. The changes over history drove us from there, but yet there's an entire group around the world: Portugal, Spain, Morocco, Central and South America, Spain, Portugal, that all embrace a language called Ladino, which is the Spanish version of Yiddish, and that there is an entire different community that are all Jewish, but yet their origins are not Eastern European, as mine is, but they are North African. And things changed in North Africa. Things radically changed in North Africa as the advancement of Islam began to sweep Asia. It then, by nature, because of Egypt being an African nation, began to take hold. And the advancement of the colonization, the jihad through immigration and migration in overtaking communities, became a part of the strategy of once was not referred to as hijra, but is now considered to be a model of advancement as we see in Europe. When you came back, your children were with you. You had 3 with you.
When I came back after Stephen's death, I had all 4 children.
But I'm talking about your first trip over. You came back, and
we had our 3 children with us at that point.
And so, what was their experience over there? Did they find it to be unusual, invigorating? Was it a story that they had to tell to their friends?
Yeah, it was interesting for them. And it was also interesting for us to observe how children interact with cultural differences and even, climate differences. But I think by God's grace, they did incredibly well. It was like an adventure to them, and where we were was like a big sandbox to them. So they enjoyed having sand just outside the door, and they enjoyed trying new food. They enjoyed seeing people. It was a little difficult for them in the very beginning, not understanding what people were saying, but for the most part, the kids, and they were at that point, they were 2, 3, and 5 years old. And for them, it was really just an adventure. And God's grace was certainly on them, and they were in good health the whole time. My son went with my husband to help rebuild a home, which had formerly been a shack for a single woman who had 7 children, and their shack had collapsed and injured one of the children. And so he was there, but his job as a 3-year-old was just to play with the local children. And he did it well. He looked forward to it every day. As children, you don't need language acquisition. Play is universal language. And so he loved it. And then my girls were in the women's prison with me each day, and they enjoyed it so much too. Just to see them interact with people, not worried about what people will think and not worried about the differences. They just were looking for fun. I mean, they were kids. And so Stephen and I realized at that point, the importance of our own attitudes being in check, because obviously attitudes are contagious and children learn very quickly. So it really helped us out to have that accountability to just be positive about everything we were experiencing. And overall, it was a really good experience for my kids.
How long between the time that you came back from this initial trip, I guess it was an orientation trip or a familiarization trip, the first trip, how long before you made the decision to return?
It was about a year before we finally said yes to that transition to move back, maybe a little less than a year. And so at that point, when we did commit to go, I was pregnant with our 4th child. And so as soon as she was 3 weeks old, we were on our way to learn French for a semester in Quebec and then on to North Africa.
When you came back to the States and you looked at the radical difference in American life, you'd been separated from it for a while, you began to appreciate things differently, you began to assess things differently, you saw that poverty, as we might describe it, is a way of life in the nations that you were visiting, that our measurement and standards of what is acceptable, what is tolerable, were really kind of the norm in those countries, and the awareness of the living conditions was not so radically different from the perspective of those who lived there, was it?
Yeah, you're right. It was, I don't know if your listeners have or watchers have heard the term reentry culture shock, but that definitely happened to all of us. From the first time we stepped out of the plane in New York, and my children were just so excited to see a water fountain. They had forgotten what they were, what they did, and then escalators were scary yet exciting. And so, yeah, there were things that we took for granted, I think, before we went and moved to North Africa. But I think it was for Stephen and I most, it was just a sobering and very difficult challenge to come back after having lived in that scenario of poverty for so long. We were there 2 years before we came back the first time for furlough, and so we came back, and the second I walked into Walmart, I nearly fell over. I just couldn't believe it. I just saw Walmart differently. I mean, you have an entire aisle with how many different kinds of cereal, and I just came from a culture where they might have, especially in the poorest areas, have a bowl of rice and maybe a little pinch of meat for breakfast, and it was really difficult. But I think for me, the physical poverty almost was blurred by the spiritual poverty. When we came back, we had also not really thought much before we left about how many churches are in our town. And so when we're driving just from the airport back to my parents' house, I could have counted probably 30, 40 churches. Mm-hmm. And it was, I think at that point, I just was so deeply burdened that we understand here in the U.S. what blessing we have and how much of this blessing needs to be shared for God's purposes, for His kingdom, in areas where it is not being shared yet. And yeah, so I think that those were the two most difficult things coming back, re-entering the U.S. after the first 2 years on the field there.
Emily, statistically speaking, there is on average one missionary per every 1 million Muslims. That's the statistical analysis out of the U.S. churches based on surveys. One missionary per every 1 million Muslims. Now, the community that you were in was a Muslim stronghold. Is that correct?
Yes, that would be correct. They brag of being 100% Muslim.
100% Muslim. So how did you gain entry into this country?
Yeah, we even though we did missions training, quote unquote, we realized that the word missionary had a stigma in that area of the world. So we didn't want to go in, and have them already just size us up as being these militant Christians coming in to convert and proselytize. We really felt like we should go in as people who follow Jesus and live there just as we would have lived here in the United States.
Right.
And that meant living a lifestyle of our faith. And we found that very easy to do actually when we went. Well, I'll back up and continue answering your question. We went to do relief and development. We had favor from the government to start a non-governmental organization, and we did projects in the prisons, and we opened training centers. We had a microcredit lending program for cooperatives of families or 4 to 5 people who needed a small loan to start a business to be able to make a living for their families. That was actually our favorite project that we had going on. And all of these things were really the hands and feet of Jesus, but we had opportunity as we went about our day doing project work just to exemplify our faith. And we found it so easy to do in that context because, as you know, is a Muslim is spiritual, and it's not a category in their lives. Like we're tempted to let it be here in the West. I'm a Christian, but that's a compartment of my life. I go and I practice that on Sundays. The rest of the week I'm just doing what I should do and living my life in a good way. But for a Muslim, it's their full identity. It's who they are. They were born that way, and it affects every area of their lives, even what they eat. And what they say before they eat, and what they say before they get in a car and drive away. I mean, they're very, very spiritual people. And so we found it easy and very unawkward to just live our faith out loud and say, yes, praise God, or God willing, or, God is so good. He blessed us today because he did this or did that. And they saw us differently when they saw that we lived our faith out loud, because in the they'd met Christians before, but they never heard anything of their faith. They just knew they were Christians. So they became curious. Okay, you're really a follower of Jesus. You're a practicing Christian. What does that mean? What do you do in practice? And so we were able to just live our lives in a way that they saw our faith, and many became curious and asked about it, gave us opportunities for conversation. But just really living in front of them as we would live in front of our Christian brothers and sisters in the church here. If I need to stop and pray for you because you have an issue, I'll stop and pray for you. And I've never, ever, neither of us had ever been turned down when we've asked our friends and our neighbors in that context if we could pray for them in Jesus' name. And most people find that stunning and shocking, but it's true. They appreciate prayer. It's such a high value in their lives. And I think we have so much more ability to bridge a gap than I think we take advantage of. And that's just one way, is just speaking like you're a real Christian and pray like you're a real Christian.
Did your children go to a madrash, or were they homeschooled?
I homeschooled my children, except for my youngest, went to a French school in the city where we were, and I homeschooled the 3 older ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
The perception from when you arrived and the perception when you left, give me the change in who you were received as and who you were sent out as.
Yeah, when we first moved into the culture, we found a home in a neighborhood, and I was worried. I didn't know how to make friends, and this is all going through my mind as we're going. Of course, as a worried mother, I'm wondering, what am I doing to my kids, and am I going to mess them up? Are they going to have any, friends, whatever? I don't know what these people are going to think of us, because again, this is shortly after 9/11 when we went in, and so I had this idea that maybe they saw us as, Christians and infidels and deserving to be killed for that. I didn't know any better. But when we moved into our home, we finally found a place to live. We moved into our home, and I would say within the hour we had knocks on the door. If it weren't the neighborhood children, it was our neighbors, welcoming us to their neighborhood, and very curious. They have never had Westerners live so close to them before, and they were just fighting over us to invite us over for dinner. One neighbor would be like, "But I want you to come to my house," and we'd be like, "Well, this neighbor over here already invited us in," and it was almost a bickering, because they just were so anxious to get to know who we were, why were we there, and what were we really like. They had never met a real Christian. They had never met an American. They had never met, I'm sure they had met white people, but in the end, they just were such wonderful friends and so loyal, and we felt very protected in our little community because we had just wonderful relationships with everyone.
Was there a mosque in the community, a local imam, or how was the community structured?
Yeah, absolutely. There is at least one mosque for every block, I think. I mentioned we have so many churches here in our neighborhood here in the United States, but we could stand on our roof and look any direction and point at a minaret. And one very, very close to our house. They were everywhere. Yeah. And yeah, the imams, I'm sure they each had imams. We never had the the chance to meet the one that was in the mosque closest to us. However, in our training center, where Stephen worked most of his days with overseeing project work, we were right across the street from the oldest mosque in the city and the most well-respected imam. And he developed a very close relationship with this imam.
Did you find that you were being sized up by your actions, your family interaction, your relationship with your husband, your treatment of others, more so than the words Jesus or the word Bible or the word Christianity?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And again, they're curious, even during Ramadan, they would ask everywhere I'd go, "Are you fasting today?" Because they just knew, obviously, that we love God and we serve God, even though we're Christians and they're Muslims. But they were very interested in that. When they learned that we prayed, they were always just so amazed. And so then they would just ask, "Okay, are you fasting?" And that gave us opportunity to share, well, we do fast. We as followers of Jesus fast often, but, and I tell them the scripture of when Jesus said, when you fast, don't do so with, an air about you that you're just suffering or whatever, because your reward will be in heaven, and just telling them, I do fast, but I don't tell people when I'm fasting because it's between me and God, and because if I tell you, then that would be my reward. And they are always just so amazed at these answers because they didn't realize that Christians live this way. And so for one example, I think is my favorite example, is my neighbor right across the street. Often I would go over and have tea with her, and I spoke French with her most of the time. She was an educated lady, but she didn't realize I was learning the local dialect of Arabic as well. And we were there visiting, and she had a sister-in-law and some other relatives that were visiting, some women, and we were all reclining, drinking our tea, speaking French, and then she switches to Arabic and tells her friends, this lady here, she's American and she's a Christian, but she prays. And they were all like gasping, what? And she fasts, and she's married to the same man, and they have 4 children, and they were just all amazed. And it was so funny. I understood every word she said, but she didn't realize it. And to me, that was just such an affirmation that it is simple to live your faith out loud all the time without an agenda and without, perfect rhetoric or wording to get them to understand what you're saying. Now, I would have to say that, yes, you should use your words, but I think it just prepares the ground to be able to show someone that you're a sincere person, that you sincerely love them, that you are a follower of Christ, you love God. These things will show in our actions. And yeah, even Stephen, he was often confronted by people just amazed at how he treated me, and amazed at how he treated his children, and how he was never angry or upset, even when he had right to be, at work or with projects. And that really just created such a reputation for him that he became known throughout the city we lived in as a godly man. And so people, initially would try and come and convert him, but eventually they gave up. They just realized, okay, whatever he's doing, it must be right, so let him be.
How large a city was this, population-wise?
Yeah, the population of the city we lived in, which is the capital city, was part of the year about 2 million. And then the other part of the year, it would drop down to about, I think, 200,000 or something, as people would go out into the villages during festivals and things. So.
Did you run into other missionaries while you were there? Was there a community?
Yeah, we knew of other workers there as well who we interacted with. Some things we were able to do together as far as project work, and even some, discipleship. We could work together in that area at times. And we fellowshiped together. There is a Protestant church. Actually, it's part of the Catholic Church there, but a room on the side of the Catholic Church that the Protestants rent out. And so we do have fellowship we have worship services every week, but it's open only to expatriates. It is against the law, which is by the agreement of the Catholic Church when it was built there in the 1960s, that they would not allow any locals to darken the doors. Although I know of several who have come in disguised. So yeah, there are people seeking, and they are anxious to know what's going on in that church, in those services. So
were you required to cover your head, to cover your face? Were you required to distinguish yourself as a non-offensive female in their environment?
yeah, I wouldn't say I was required to do any of that. We were pretty autonomous as far as from our sending organization, because we did want to be who we said we were there to be, and that was relief and development workers who just happened to love Jesus and follow Jesus. But I found it such a bridge to my friends to be able to cover my head around them. Now, particularly when they would visit my home and it were lady friends, I wouldn't bother covering my head. If I go to their home, I always cover my head. Most of the time I'll wear their local clothing, just because, their brothers, their husbands might come into the room, and I don't want to create any kind of threatening atmosphere to them and for them, and so I want to be respectful of them. And I've found that to be extremely effective, just to be modest at least. I mean, I've never had any of them sneer at me if I didn't have my head covered by chance. Right. They don't mind. They understand I am not a Muslim. They understand that I'm from the West, and so they are aware enough of the West to know that we don't cover our heads. But they also are very appreciative when I do, especially during special meals or visits where I know there will be men in the room. So.
Okay. You came back to the States. You were here for, did you say 2 years?
We were here just for 3 months after we were 2 years on the ground in North Africa, yeah.
All right. And then what prompted the return?
Prompted the return to the United States?
No, prompted the return back.
Oh, well, we were committed to work there indefinitely, and so we just would come home every 2 years to visit with supporters and donors who helped fund our project work as well as our family, and also to share with people here about our work and really recruit, basically, because the need was overwhelming to have more workers come. And so we would come home every 2 years to do that, also to visit family, of course, first and foremost. So we would do that every 2 years until, when Stephen was killed, obviously.
Well, let's go to that point in time where you returned back, and now had the community changed? Al-Qaeda was certainly a presence in the region. Were they a presence in your city? And had you encountered them in the first 2 years?
Well, I think just the nature of my husband's work in the men's prison particularly, I think, and I'm sure he encountered extremists. I'm not sure about Al-Qaeda members. They had not really infiltrated this country too much until about 2007. But the government of this country is very anti-terrorist, and they want nothing to do with terrorism or fundamentalism. Now, they are very spiritual. They are still, following the Sharia law, obviously not to the note, right. But they're very proudly Islamic, but also very anti-violence and anti-terrorists. So for us, we felt a little bit of comfort knowing that the government was anti-terrorist, but obviously, we're in the desert, and it's difficult to really monitor an invisible border between other countries who were experiencing these influxes of terrorism. Al-Qaeda and the Salafists is what they were referred to in that area. And so for us, we realized the risk was increasing. Obviously, we weren't fully protected. It is a developing country, and they try their best to protect their borders and their citizens, but they can only do so much. They did partner with the U.S. The U.S. Embassy has a strong presence there as well, so they had our military come over and train their military how to monitor the desert and how to monitor different situations. But they were coming in. They were getting closer and closer to the capital, and we were very aware of that by 2008 and 9. And so we realized the risk was increasing. There were other workers, other missionaries who were pulled out or decided to leave temporarily until things blew over. But Stephen and I prayed and really didn't feel a peace at all about leaving the situation just because of heightened risk. There was no black and white valid risk against us besides the fact that we were Jesus followers. We're white-skinned. We're from the West. We felt overall very welcomed and very protected by the community there because the vast majority appreciated what we were doing and why we were there. And the government as well was very, very, very appreciative of that as well. And actually, Stephen had a friend in the government who approached him in early 2009 and said, I think that we know why you're here and we know what you're really doing behind the scenes, but we appreciate so much what you're doing for our community and our people. So please just be careful. And at that point, we realized, okay, the risk obviously is not from the government standpoint, actually from the extremists, the fundamentalists who are within the community and invisible per se because they blend in so well. So we knew that the risk was rising, but we felt strongly, and Stephen more so even than I, that we were supposed to stick it out and just count the cost.
Right. Did you, in your first 2 years there, did you sense the militant presence? Did you sense a rising in the advancement of a group that were buying into and here you were in a 100% Muslim country, which kind of sets the tone for why do you need a radical presence in a community that already is adherent? So from a logical standpoint, did any of that make sense to you?
In the beginning, it didn't make sense to us. And honestly, in the beginning, we weren't seeing much or hearing much. I mean, we were registered with the U.S. Embassy and we get the warden messages and different things. But in the beginning, I mean, there was a little bit of reality of risk, or reality of some fundamentalists who had the potential to create an uprising or wreak havoc in the city. But for the most part, it was very contained and we felt quite safe. We lived and worked there for the first, I would say, 5 years without even hearing of an incident very close to home at all of extremism. I think we just, from our experience, our friends were more concerned about it than we were per se, because they didn't want anything to do with this, terrorism either. And I think for our local friends, they heard in the mosque, they realized there are people who have the potential to swing more towards the extreme side. And there were a few, I mean, definitely the minority, but there were a few who did not want any Westerners there, that didn't want any, not even, non-governmental work going on or humanitarian work by Westerners, because they wanted to protect their Islamic country and their government. But again, they were the minority. They had very little power in the government. Of course, there was an opposition. I would say it was probably the first time we realized that these people were there and there was the potential of this happening. There was an opposition group in the first democratic election, and this opposition group was very much along the lines of the Brotherhood you would see in Egypt. They, again, were the minority. They didn't even hardly make it to the polls because they had such a very tiny following. But it did help us realize, yeah, they're here. This is a real risk. There are very extreme sentiments here against Westerners and Christianity, for sure.
So tell me about that day. Take us to that day where Stephen was literally walking down the street.
Yeah, that day was a very normal day for us. I mean, every day Stephen would take our youngest daughter to school, and we carpooled with some other families, and then he would just go on to the training center that was located right across the street from the mosque, and um, he would arrive early, obviously, because dropping her off, the morning prayers would be finished, and the streets would be very quiet. None of the shops opened up yet. But this particular morning, it was a Tuesday morning. I remember he was leaving the house that morning and was very rarely late. Stephen was a very prompt person, but they were rushing that morning, and we were trying to get them out the door so that my daughter could get to school on time. And he, for the first time that I can ever remember, didn't hug me right away as he was walking out, because that was just what we did. The whole 16 years we were married, we always started the day with just a wonderful hug, long hug. And so he was running out the door, and then he stopped in his tracks and came back and just apologized and gave me an extra long hug, I would say. And then he was off. So I didn't think anything. I just went to homeschooling my son, and my daughters were working on something, in another room, and there's a knock at the door. And so I go to open the door, and there stands one of our teammates who was there working with us from Scandinavia. A very serious woman, very unemotional most of the time. She was, I'd never even seen her cry that I could remember, except for maybe once. And she was standing there sobbing, and I just I was just shocked. And her husband's name was Stephen as well, and I knew he had been traveling in the interior, and we had been praying for him. And so I'm like, "What's wrong, Laura?" And so she just takes me by the arm and takes me into a room and closes the door, and she said, "Something has happened. Something terrible's happened. Stephen's been shot." And I just think, "Oh no, her husband's been shot," So I start consoling her, and she looks me in the eye and she says, "No, not my Stephen. Your Stephen was shot, and he's dead." And I, of course, just stopped breathing. My heart stops. I don't even remember anything, but the first thought comes into my mind: there's no way, they have the wrong person. Or maybe he was shot, but he's not dead, and I'm starting to rationalize. And then immediately I'm thinking, but how am I going to tell my children? How am I going to tell my in-laws? What's going on, And so she gives me a minute to catch my breath, and she said, "But we have to get you out of here because the guys are on the loose who shot him. They took off, and they're still out there somewhere." And everyone in the city knew where our family, not everyone, but most of the city knew our family, where we lived. We were pretty high profile, whether we wanted to be or not. And so we were evacuated to her house on the other side of town. But before we left, I sat my children down in front of me, and I said, "Something's happened to your dad, and we need to go." And so my oldest daughter says, "Well, is he okay?" And I could only just say, "Well, no." I still hadn't let it sink in that he was really gone. But I had the kids grab their belongings, a change of clothes, and I grabbed our passports, and we were off to the other side of the city. And the whole time I'm realizing, I didn't even pray. What do I pray? And as I'm sitting there in the car and it's dead silent, the only prayer that could come to my mind was just a prayer to ask God, "Please tell me this was not in vain. Just please tell me you're glorified. Because if you're glorified, then I know it wasn't in vain, because I know that you're worthy, and I know that Stephen was absolutely willing and committed to taking the gospel no matter the cost." And I just sensed the Lord, the Holy Spirit just told me in my heart, I am glorified today. And I can't say that I didn't ever ask why after that point, but that settled something in my spirit that I can't describe. Obviously, it was a torturous turn of events, and that day I wish I could forget it forever. But the Lord was just so close to our family. And when I got to this lady's house, our teammate's house, and I took each of the children one at a time into a room to tell them the reality of the situation, they cried, we prayed, but I just saw such an incredible grace over my children, even during this tragedy, and unbelievable. Yeah, so the Lord was just so good. So much more to that story that day. If anyone's interested, they obviously should get the book and read more about it. But yeah.
You've written a book called We Died Before We Came. Walk me through an understanding of why that title, because the title is written in retrospect. It's not written as a contemporary journal of your journey. It's written in an after-the-fact mode as to kind of sets the stage where you are and then takes you to this event. But you come to some startling revelations about how God works in these times of what we would call the human tragedy, but it is not the heavenly tragedy.
Right. Yeah, the quote actually was a quote that Stephen himself had said about a week and a half before he was murdered. We had a gentleman in our home who was there in the country doing some research on how the church was growing or multiplying in that area, and he realized, I think, as he did his research, that we were definitely living in valid risk. And so he asked Stephen after dinner. He just asked him point blank, "Are you not afraid that you are going to lose your life? Aren't you afraid that for your family that you've come here and you're just going to lose your lives?" And Stephen didn't miss a beat. He just said immediately, "Well, no, we died before we came here." And what he meant was the quote he had heard and had used several times over our years there in North Africa, but the quote actually was originally quoted by, I think it was James Calvert, who went out to the cannibals of the Fiji Islands, I think in the 1800s, as a missionary. And the ship captain told him, "You should turn back. You'll lose your life and the life of those with you if you go among those savages." But to that, Calvert replied, "We died before we came here." And that was our situation. Every time we became aware of risk, and when we were tempted to be afraid and just throw in the towel and back out, and really we would have had plenty of support in that. And I don't think God would have condemned us for that. Obviously, He left the door open behind us when we entered this scenario. But we just wanted so much to obey the Lord, and we died literally to anything and everything that would come between us and fully obeying and fully giving glory to God.
What period of time is this written in? What is the, is this a contemporary story several years ago? When did this occur?
2010.
2010.
Is when his death occurred, but I wrote the book, and over the few years after that, I worked on writing the book and refining it, and it was finally released in September of last year.
And where are you now? What are you doing now? And what is the life vision for you and these precious children?
Sure. Yeah, I am back in North Carolina with my family, where we are reaching to internationals around us. And when we're here in country, the Lord's given me a lot of opportunity to travel and to speak and to teach in missions training schools and even in universities, in different venues, just about His heart for the Muslim world, and His heart for the church here, and how we realistically and very spiritually should respond to the Muslims coming to us here in the United States. I want the church here to see this through a lens of faith and not a lens of fear. We can't overlook the opportunity that God's giving us to reach people who are coming out of isolated areas where it would possibly be impossible for us to get a visa to anyway. But that's how much he loves the nations, and that's how much he wants the praise and adoration of every tribe, tongue, and language. Now, I was remarried 5 years ago. God just totally threw me for a loop when he put in my path a man who had lost his spouse. His wife had died of breast cancer and was raising his children on his own and doing ministry in Chicago with internationals, and particularly with Muslims. And we had trained at the same training facility in Texas, and he had vowed just to finish his calling with his children, on their own, and I had too. We both just thought there's no way that there would be anybody else that could fill the shoes of our spouse and have the same heart, have the same vision. So I just totally wrote it off. I just assumed I would die a widow, but the Lord had different plans, and his name's Lewis. He's an incredible guy, loves the Lord, and absolutely loves the nations, especially those that God is bringing to us here. So it's interesting. He's in urban missions, obviously, does a lot of research, a lot of teaching on urbanization and what that looks like in the kingdom and in global evangelism. And then, of course, my heart's still stuck in North Africa for the most part. So he goes back with me about twice a year and loves the country, trying to learn the language. And he's been so well respected and so well received by our friends and colleagues there. And I'm just so blessed. So now we have 6 kids, like the Brady Bunch, I guess. And God has just so blessed us. Our kids are incredible. I have a grandson now. And the Lord is still just sending us everywhere. My husband actually is in LA this week teaching on this topic. And we look to go back for the summer to North Africa and continue discipleship, continue working on these projects that are opening the door for the gospel. So,
Emily, I'll leave you with this thought in this challenge, and I thank you for not taking a break. We normally take a break at the bottom of the hour, but I was so enthralled with your story that I didn't want to break away. And since it's my show, my network, and my microphone, I have that ability. I have come to the realization, maybe through divine inspiration, maybe through logical reason, I'd rather give the credit to the Lord than my own, but isn't it amazing that God has created people groups around the world that we can so easily identify as people who need the gospel? We have the Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem that wear their black coats. There's somebody that needs the gospel. We have throughout India the Hindus, which mark their heads and wear traditional attire. And we look at them as a foreign group, but I look at them as, hey, there's somebody that needs the gospel. We see in the Islamic world a particular type of attire by both men and women, and we look at it with fear and confusion, and my renewed attitude is, hey, isn't that amazing? God has showed us somebody so specifically they need the gospel. We see a man and a woman, or a man and a man walking down the street holding hands, and we look at it with condemnation and disgust, and I look at them and say, hey, isn't that amazing that God just showed me this couple needs the gospel?
Amen.
And we have got to shy away from this inclination of shunning, condemnation, and withholding of the gospel to those that look like ourselves. I give the illustration that I was 44 years old as an observant Jewish man in the synagogue all my life before I heard the gospel. Imagine if it had passed me by. Why someone would not share it with me, but what would have been my destiny had someone not had taken the time to identify my kippah, my attire, and the place of worship that I walked into, to be able to say, here's your sign, I need the gospel. So, Emily Foreman, I cannot thank you enough. I know there's so much more to your story, and I would love to have you back on the program to tell the rest of the story, because this is a story of tragedy, a story of renewal, a story of a heart to reach the lost by not writing a check, but by moving your family into the heart of the community and finding that there were those that were hungry to hear the gospel, and it was because you loved them. That's how it happened.
Amen.
We died before we came here. A true story of sacrifice and hope. Emily Foreman lost her husband, a true Christian martyr. Not one you read about just because it's at the end of the book. A contemporary, believing man walking down the streets of a Muslim nation, gunned down, but yet his surviving spouse returns on a regular basis to carry out the work of reaching the Muslim community with the good news. You may not feel called to do it, but read this story and find a way to support the work that Emily Foreman and her family are doing to reach those who are in desperate need of the gospel. We died before we came here. A true story of sacrifice and hope. Go to ignitingnation.com, click on Books and Media, and you too need to read this story. Emily Foreman, thank you. God bless you for all you do. We suffer by your side for your loss and rejoice in the family that God has brought you. But Stephen's memory will forever remain.
Thank you so much, Reverend Rabbi. It's been such an honor to be with you today. And God bless you and your ministry, and may He multiply it for His glory.
Thank you. And for you also. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we are going to bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.